So we go to Acts 21, which is a story where Paul comes to James, and James, they're discussing what's been done in the ministry, and James says, here we have all these believers in the Messiah who are zealous for the Torah, but there's this rumor about you, Paul, that you're teaching these things, and I'm going to read you exactly what it says. They've been told about you that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise your children or walk according to our customs. And this is, in James's mind, this is a false rumor, because he says, we've got to do something about this. We have to do, and I'm going to read exactly what it says here.
Let me just jump in here. It's a false rumor to James, but to many Christians, it's actually true today. Am I right?
A lot of Christian doctrine comes from false accusations that are levied against Paul, unfortunately.
It's ironic.
James says, what then is to be done? They'll certainly hear that you've come. Do therefore what we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Take these men and purify yourself along with them and pay their expenses, so they may shave their heads. Thus all will know that there is nothing in what they've been told about you. Mm-hmm. So James' whole purpose here is we've got to show them there's nothing true about what's being said.
In other words, that Paul actually is upholding the Torah, according here to this account, and he's got to demonstrate that to the people by participating in this ritual sacrifice, this ritual in the temple, and this is after according to the Gospels, the death and resurrection of Yeshua, which according to some people today, the Torah was done away with. That when he said it is finished, that was the end of the Torah. That's what some people believe. That's John Chrysostom, we're going to see later, says that. Yes.
So at this point, we're in agreement about what's going on. However, the next verse, he's reading from King James Bible, and I'm reading from ESV Bible. And I'm going to read it in the King James Version, which is the version he's reading. I read my version, and he stops me. He says, hold on a second. You've got to stop. Read that again. And I read it again, and then he reads me his version. I'm going to read King James Version here. They say, take them and purify them, and be at charges with them, that they may shave their heads, and all may know those things whereof they were informed concerning thee are nothing, but that thou thyself also walkest orderly, keeping the law. As touching Gentiles which believe, we have written and concluded that they observe no such thing.
Wow. Yeah, guys, I'm going to read that again because that's just so powerful. Did you read the ESV there yet? Or could you read us how it's different?
The ESV reads differently.
Yeah. Okay.
The ESV reads,
see that.
But as for the Gentiles who have believed, we have sent a letter with our judgment that they should abstain from what has been sacrificed from idols and from blood and what has been strangled and from sexual immorality.
Wow. Okay, so there's a fundamental difference. I don't know if you guys caught that. We're going to go back over it again. But I want to bring you here first to what he says in Acts 15, because he's alluding back or referring back to something which actually first happened in the book of Acts, where there were people coming to the early, what's called the early church, and saying these Gentiles can't be saved unless they follow these laws, these Pharisee laws, so it seems.
Right, you had Pharisees who became believers.
That's right. And so in Acts 15, let's see, it's verse 20, he said, you should write to them to abstain from the things polluted by idols. In other words, in Acts 21, it's just reiterating what he already had said. Things polluted by idols and from sexual immorality and from what has been strangled and from blood. For from ancient generations, Moshe has had in every city those who proclaim him, for he is read every Sabbath in the synagogues. In other words, the discussion here in the book of Acts, originally in what's called the Jerusalem Council, is we have these people who aren't Jews, and we have to decide, can we even let them into the synagogue? Are they even allowed to step foot in the synagogue to be part of what's called at that time this body of believers? And the Pharisees say, no, not unless they're circumcised and stand before a panel of rabbis. Then if they want to believe in Yeshua, great. Otherwise, they can't even step foot in. And what James decides is, no, there's 4 things we need to get them started. These are the 4 essential things. And then the rest they'll hear every week in the synagogue. And to me, the analogy here is to Abraham. And look, I stole this from Paul. Paul of Tarsus, he says this, right? That Abraham had this covenant with God. And he came into the land when he was 75 years old. But he walked around for decades uncircumcised, walking with the Creator. It wasn't until he was 99 years old that God told him, okay, now it's time to be circumcised. And I think this is what Paul was teaching, and certainly what it seems from James is, look, circumcision for an adult is no small matter. Even today, in Israel, for example, it can only be done in a hospital.
Yeah.
It's a very serious thing. And so the point here is, yes, they can come in the synagogue and they'll hear the Torah, and as they're led, that's what they'll be led to do and keep. But don't keep them out. Don't bar them from joining just because they're uncircumcised. They weren't circumcised. It's easy for me to say get circumcised. It happened when I was 8 days old, right? Don't remember it. Well, I remember a little bit, but anyway. So, my mother, we won't talk about that. So, let's go back to the book of Acts, chapter 21, verse 25. But and this is the ESV, as for the Gentiles who have believed, we have sent a letter with our judgment that they should abstain from these 4 things. But in the King James Version that John is reading with his friend, there's 8 extra words. In the Greek, it's 6 words. In the English, it's 8 extra words. As touching the Gentiles, meaning concerning the Gentiles which believe, we have written and concluded, James says, that they observe no such thing, referring to the Torah that Paul is demonstrating that he's keeping. That's only for Paul the Jew, according to the King James. It's not for the Gentiles. The only thing they need to keep is these 4 basic things. So the Gentiles are allowed to steal, according to this. The Gentiles are allowed to murder. They just can't drink blood. The Gentiles are allowed to do all kinds of things, just not these 4 things, according to the way that this could be read in the King James. So you're having this conversation, John, with your friend, and he's got his version, and you've got your version, and what do? How do you convince him? Do you convince him?
I can't say that I did.
Okay.
The first thing that I did is I pulled up some textual commentaries, and immediately they all say the exact same thing, that this is in a certain manuscripts, it's not in others. The general conclusion is that this text does not belong in the scriptures. And the fundamental problem we have, and this is not a unique problem between me and my friend, anybody that's ever sat down at a table with more than 3 or 4 people, you're reading different versions of the Bible. They don't always read exactly the same way. And in this particular instance, I asked him, I said, we've got to be willing to go beyond the text that we have here on our English pages, and we need to do a study here, and we need to determine what the original language of the Bible is. We have a variant here, and we have to get beyond this. The textual commentaries, there's manuscript images that we can go through. We've got a lot of material here we can look at, and there's a very clear conclusion that this text doesn't belong.
Can we look at the versions where this appears? Because you guys have to understand, a lot of times when you're looking at different Bible translations, they'll translate the same thing differently. Here, they're not translating the same thing differently. There's extra words. That's a very different kind of problem. So we actually have here a list that John put together of these 8 words that they should observe no such thing except, right? Those are very key words because that thing there is the Torah, right? This is a direct instruction from James. Don't keep the Torah in the King James. So what are the different versions, John? Tell us that you found.
Well, it does not appear in the Net Bible, the ESV Bible, RSV. Most of the modern Bibles don't have it. The only Bibles that contain it are Bibles that are based on Textus Receptus, like the King James 1611, and those Bibles that came from that similar source.
So tell people, what is this Textus Receptus? Because that sounds very authoritative, right? It's the received text. It's the one that Paul himself or whoever, right? It's certainly that came from the apostles, right?
Not exactly.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
So what is the Textus Receptus?
We don't have the original manuscripts that the apostles wrote. We don't have the original gospels that the gospel authors wrote. We have copies of copies of copies. And there's 5,800 approximately, finding more every day, 5,800 copies of New Testament manuscripts. However, those copies don't always agree with one another. So somebody has to look at these copies where they vary, and decisions have to be made. Are we going to use this version of the text or that version of the text? And this instance here in Acts just happens to be one of those locations where one text reads one way and many other texts read another way.
Now, you mentioned to me something about this verse I thought was really interesting, that as far as you know, this is the only direct place in the New Testament where it tells you not to keep the Torah.
Not only that, but this is plain, simple language. Our Father is not going to make us guess what the commandments are. We don't have to interpret an allegory to find out, thou shalt not commit adultery. If he doesn't want us committing adultery, he just says, thou shalt not commit adultery.
Straightforward.
We should not have to go through elaborate interpretations of, Peter says that Paul's hard to understand. We shouldn't have to go through allegories in Paul to determine how we're supposed to behave. Conduct, commandments are done in plain, simple language. And here in the King James Bible, we have plain, simple language indicating
Don't keep
that
the
the
Torah.
Gentiles should not observe no such thing.
No such thing.
So this is a huge issue because this has ramifications. There's many textual variants, and most textual variants are on things that have no bearing on your walk or conduct to your faith.
Right.
But in this case, one version tells us that we should not obey the Torah, and without it, this story in Acts 21 is the clearest example in the New Testament of believers after the death, burial, and resurrection of the Messiah who are zealous for the Torah and keeping the Torah.
Now, guys, I want to jump over to something from the Tanakh, okay? Because I'm coming from a Tanakh Old Testament perspective. When I read the Tanakh, we also have what are called textual variants. What do we mean by that? So we do not have the original copy of the Torah that Joshua wrote on the tablets of stone that were covered with plaster. It's described in the book of Joshua. We don't have the original Torah that Moses completed that he wrote. We have copies of copies of copies of copies. And what we do is we look at different manuscripts and we compare them and we try to find out what did the original say. Now, sometimes the differences are very minor. For example, in Exodus 15, there's a famous example where it says, Mikdash Adonai konanu yadecha, the sanctuary of the Lord your hands have established. And in some manuscripts, instead of Lord, it says Yehovah. Well, that's kind of important. However, let's be honest, Adonai and Yehovah is the same deity, is the same God. Doesn't really change the message. What we have here between the King James Version translations is something that fundamentally changes the message. Do no such thing is a very significant difference. And what I love about this example is nobody, other than the King James only people, nobody disputes that these 6 words in Greek, 8 words in English were added. However, what's interesting is they were added in a relatively early period. You can see here we have a codex, a famous, important document, Codex Bezae. It dates to the 5th century AD, and it has those 6 words. And I love what John did here. He went through numerous manuscripts looking, are they in there? Are they not in there? Are they in there? Are they not in there? He basically taught himself Greek so he could read and identify these words in the manuscript. Codex Bezae, the 6 words are included. It says do no such thing in the 5th century. That's very early. Ephraemi Rescriptus is a really interesting codex. It's what's called a palimpsest. A palimpsest means it was recycled. They took the original gospel, they washed off the words, and they wrote a different text on top of it. What scholars in the 19th century did is they went through this thing with a microscope and took special types of photographs, and they were able to read the erased words. And what we have marked here in this 5th century, the original text of the palimpsest, it has the 6 words in Greek, do no such thing. So, 2 witnesses, and we can say, hey, everything is established by 2 or 3 witnesses. But what do you do when you have 2 witnesses that say the other way around? Here's Codex Sinaiticus from the 4th century, and when we've marked there in red, that's where the words do not appear. If the words were in the text, this is where they would be, and they're not in the 4th century Codex Sinaiticus. Codex Vaticanus, 4th century, the words are omitted. Where we put in red here is where those words would appear. So, we have 2 different versions. And John, what I love about the story you told is at the end, the way you described it to me, is we had 2, you and your friend were on the phone, and you said, you have your Bible and I have my Bible, and they're not the same. In one they appear, in the other they don't. Here's Codex Alexandrinus from the 5th century. The words are omitted. P74 is a papyrus. And you think a papyrus must be early. Not necessarily. This one's later than the codexes. It's from the 7th century. The words are omitted. So here's a quote from 2 of the greatest New Testament scholars who wrote a book called The Textual Guide to the Greek New Testament, Omanson and Metzger. Bruce Metzger is a legend in New Testament textual studies. They write, the reading, meaning those 6 words, 8 words in the English, do no such thing, is a Western paraphrase of the intent of the decree of James. And this is really interesting. These guys know that you're not supposed to keep the Torah. That's their starting assumption. And if those 6 words were inserted into the text, which they agree, those words were added, that they're paraphrasing what James's original intent. Here's what James meant to say, even though he didn't say it. So some writer in the West, the western part of the Roman Empire, this Western paraphrase added these 6 words, 8 words in English, 6 words in Greek, to tell you this is what, lest somebody read it and think you don't have to keep the Torah, lest somebody read it and think that you are supposed to keep the Torah, they added these words to make it clear, do no such thing. And what's beautiful about this example is this is not a problem of translation. It's a problem of which manuscript do we rely on. It's not that the translators of the NRSV took 6 words out of the Bible. They just based it on a different manuscript. Those 6 words that were added, that everyone except for the King James only people agree, were added. Every scholar in the world agrees those words were added, every serious scholar. Those 6 words appear in the vast majority of New Testament manuscripts. They're in what's called the Byzantine majority text. If you took the statistics, you would find a very high percentage have those added words, and only a relatively small number, in this case of early manuscripts, have the original reading where those words are not included, where they're omitted. So you can't just follow the majority of manuscripts, and you can't always follow, as we'll see, the earliest manuscripts. You have to look at the evidence and see what support there is for something.